Yo book nerds, it's February, it's Black History Month. Currently I am reading Uncle Tom's Cabin. I have never read this before and I am over halfway through it at this point and hope to be finishing this up soon. But today I want to talk about a different book. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Jacobs, but the book I want to talk about today is written by a different Harriet Jacobs, and it is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And this is a nonfiction account of Harriet's time as a slave. In the book, she calls herself Linda, but it is her story. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a work of fiction based on true events and true people, but it is a work of fiction, so there are some differences. Uncle Tom's Cabin was first published in 1851. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was first published in 1862. I read this book for college and wrote a paper on it, and I had mentioned it in a previous video, and I had said in that video that I had written that paper on this book and maybe I would talk about it more in a different video, so that's what I'm doing today. If I remember right from in that class, I took that class like 5 years ago, so bear with me as I try to remember. But I believe they had told us that this book got really overshadowed by Uncle Tom's Cabin, and so I feel like it's important to still read this book. I think Uncle Tom's Cabin is a great narration on slavery, and it will have its own video. But I wanted to talk about this one too because I think that this one is just as good. And it is really short too, so it is not a huge commitment if you want to check it out. I'm going to be doing an in-depth discussion today on this book, and so there will be spoilers. So if you don't want any of that, then don't watch this video. I'm going to pretty much talk about a very common theme throughout this book and my kind of analysis on it. So it's kind of a different video than my normal book reviews. So I want to talk about the theme of death in this narrative. Harriet talks about death a lot, and there's a lot of allusions to death too. There's so much death imagery, whether it's real physical death or metaphorical death. And right off the bat, the first sentence of chapter 1 starts off with, "I was born a slave, but I never knew it till 6 years of happy childhood had passed away." Passed away. We're starting right off the bat with an allusion to death. Her innocence dies here, and she realized she's a slave. She is not a free person. So right off the bat, we have an image of death. This happens when Harriet is 6. Her mother dies, her innocence is killed, and she realizes she's a slave. The mistress that Harriet had at this time actually took care of Harriet fairly well, so she was actually still treated better than most slaves even after her mother's death. Her mistress had taught her to read and write, so one could say that her loss of innocence was not complete until her mistress died. So her mother died, her innocence is shaken, and then her mistress dies later, and then all of the reality hits her that she is a slave. Once her mistress dies, her mistress's niece then becomes her owner, and is her new mistress. Shortly after Harriet changes owners, her father dies and a friend of hers dies too. So there's so much death very quickly on in her life. Both of her parents die, her loving mistress dies, her friend dies. Everything is just bearing down on her. Dr. Flint is the name of the father of her new mistress, and he is like the worst of the worst. He is horrible to slaves. She witnesses Dr. Flint beating other slaves, breaking up families by selling some of the slaves in families. And she knows that he has also fathered many slave children, meaning he raped slave women, and those slave women then had his babies. And one of the mothers that he rapes loses her baby, and that mother thanks God that her baby dies. So again, death coming up again, and we're seeing death as this sweet release and something that they're grateful for, and that is just heartbreaking. But then Mrs. Flint comes right back at them and kind of takes away her comfort and is like, well, your baby was a bastard, so it's not in heaven. Just horrible people. This poor slave mother's trying to find some solace in the loss of her baby, and they're trying to take even that away from her. And then shortly after that, the mother of that child that passed away also dies. So many scenes of death. And this is only like the first 15 pages of the book. Yeah, we're only on page 16. Harriet Jacobs packs so much in so few pages. It will take you for a ride. But Harriet looks on these deaths as a good thing because they are finally free. They are with God. They are no longer slaves. Jacobs writes, "The poor black woman had but the one child, whose eyes she saw closing in death, while she thanked God for taking her away from the greater bitterness of life." But not all deaths in here are thought of as good like that or portrayed as peaceful like that. There are some scenes that are very brutal. There is a description of a slave named James who is screwed into a cotton gin, and when he dies, they let rats eat him. It is very disturbing and very difficult to read. And I say this as like a warning, so if you're going to read this, be prepared to read some very disgusting, brutal things like that. And I think it's very important for us to read this because this is history. This really happened. I bring this up because there is a lot of brutal stuff written in here. And so if you're squeamish to that, be prepared for that when you read this. But I think it's very important for us to read this book because we owe it to James's memory and all the other slaves' memories to read their story and not let them get forgotten. There's other descriptions of slaves being shot in the head or being torn apart by dogs. So both throughout the narrative, death is seen as this escape and escape from fear, but death is also feared because it could be brutal. So it's like this kind of catch-22. Not all the death imagery in here, however, is literal physical death. There is so much metaphorical death and rebirth that happens in here that I also want to talk about. So eventually, when Jacobs grows up, Dr. Flint starts making advances towards her. She does not want his advances, and to try to fight him off, she takes a lover named Mr. Sands, and so she is having sex with Mr. Sands, who's a white man, to try and keep Dr. Flint away from her. Jacobs has 2 children with Mr. Sands. Their names are Benny and Ellen, but they are slaves because their mother is a slave and they go by the mother. So Harriet's a slave, her children are slaves, even though Mr. Sands is obviously a free man. When her son is born, Jacobs admits to wanting to die, and when her son is born, her wishes extend to her son. She writes, "I had often prayed for death, but now I did not want to die unless my child could die too." She only wants to live for her children, which as a mother, I feel for her. I was not a mother when I first read this, but just going through it again and reading Uncle Tom's Cabin and having some similar things happen in there, I really feel for these mothers. I don't know what I would do in their situation if my baby were in that situation. At this point in time, Harriet sees death as the only way for her and her children to escape slavery, even though she knows of slaves that have escaped slavery by running away or by being freed. So all during this time, Dr. Flint is still trying to get to her, and so she is feeling the pressure and she wants to get out and she wants to save her children. And death comes up again, but this time her escape is going to be wrapped up in physical death and metaphorical death. Harriet decides she's going to run away, and she is helped by a few people, and eventually she's hidden in her grandmother's house in the attic. She's sealed off. She can't even stand up in there, and she can't leave. Inside this attic, or garret, they refer to it as, I believe, she undergoes metaphorical death. Her limbs grow numb because of lack of movement, because she cannot move. She cannot stand up in there. She can see her family and friends through a little peephole, but they can't see her and they don't know that she's there. Her children don't know she's there. Mr. Sands doesn't know she's there. Dr. Flint doesn't know she's there. The only people that know she's there are very select few that can be trusted and that are helping her. So she is there but not there. She sees but is not seen. She is in that attic for 7 years. 7 years. After 7 years, Peter helps get her to the north. She is reborn almost out of this womb. Harriet died when she entered the attic. She died. And she's kind of in purgatory almost for 7 years. And now she is finally resurrected and on her way to heaven, to the promised end of all of this suffering. But we cannot forget her kids. She does all of this because she wants to save herself and her kids, but her kids are still there. When it is believed that Harriet has ran away to the north, her children are sold to Mr. Sands, and Mr. Sands promises to free them. Eventually, her children are sent north to be with her, and you think that it'll be happily ever after, but it is not that simple. There is still the problem that Jacobs is not actually free. Dr. Flint wants her back, and then Dr. Flint eventually claims that the children were not legally sold, so he wants them back too. But eventually, Dr. Flint dies, again bringing back death into this conversation, and you'd think it stopped there, but it doesn't, because his desires to have Harriet go down to her daughter, who's actually the owner of Harriet, if you remember from the beginning, and Flint's daughter and her husband go crazy with this idea too and want them back. All the while Harriet's in the north, she's working for a woman named Mrs. Bruce. Eventually Mrs. Bruce dies, again with the death. And then Harriet goes to England with Mrs. Bruce's daughter. They stay there for a few months, and Harriet gets even more taste of freedom. And you can see this parallel between the death of Mrs. Bruce giving Harriet a taste of more freedom, because then she was able to go out into the world with her daughter, versus the death of Dr. Flint, which creates even more of a stir around wanting her to be recaptured and take away her freedom again. So these two deaths are fighting each other back and forth pretty much. Eventually, Mr. Bruce remarries, and the second Mrs. Bruce secures Harriet's freedom from the Dodges. That is the name of Harriet's rightful owners. So finally, Harriet is free. She says, "I am deeply grateful to the generous friend who procured it, but I despise the miscreant who demanded payment for what never rightfully belonged to him or his. I had objected to having my freedom bought, yet I must confess that when it was done, I felt as if a heavy load had been lifted from my weary shoulders." So obviously she was grateful, but it still made her sick that she had to be bought and then be set free. But she can finally breathe and know that she will never have to be a slave again. But death is not over in the book yet. The last couple instances of death, though, aren't so grave. Harriet's grandmother that had hit her passes away, but her grandmother lived long enough to see Harriet and her children get to safety and get their freedom. The other death is of Harriet's uncle Philip, and that is interesting because an obituary was written for him, and in the obituary they call him a citizen, which obituaries at this time were never written for black people, and they never called them citizens either. So it was very, very rare, if rare is even the best term to use because it just never happened. It was unprecedented. But that death really shows how death is the great equalizer. Everyone dies, nobody can escape death. And he was called a citizen in death. Throughout this entire book, death is just this constant, ever-present thing. Sometimes it is real, physical death, and then other times it is metaphorical death. And there are deaths that are seen as blessings, and there is death that is just brutal, horrifying, awful. And it just gives you so much to think about throughout the entire thing. I think this is a great, great narration on slavery, and I think more people need to be reading this. Now that I'm reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, I understand why this got overshadowed since Uncle Tom's Cabin came out first and it's longer, but don't overlook this one. Please, please read it. You will learn so much, and it will give you such an appreciation for everything that slaves had to go through, and the strength of Harriet Jacobs to do what she had to do to get herself and her children safe is just amazing to me. It is a testament to the strength of a mother and just a testament to the strength of an individual in general. Let me know if you've read this book and what your thoughts on it were. I think I've talked enough about the theme of death in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, so I am going to end it there. If you enjoyed this video, please like, and if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, please be sure to do that as well. I put out videos every Monday. I will see you guys next week. Thanks for talking books with me.